Let's turn to Georgia now. The Prime Minister there is vowing to eradicate, his words, the country's liberal fascist opposition, his words again, escalating the government's bitter campaign against its rivals as mass pro-EU protests enter a second week. Tbilisi has been rocked by turmoil since the governing Georgian Dream Party, which critics accuse of creeping authoritarianism and of leading the country back into Russia's orbit, claimed victory in a disputed election in October. The government said last Thursday it would suspend EU membership talks until 2028. Now, this sparked uproar, and the scenes we're seeing now, a fresh wave of demonstrations that have been met with a heavy-handed response from the authorities. Let's get the analysis and bring in Tinatin Jaboritsa, who's the Eurasia political risk analyst at the Eurasia Group, joining us live from Tbilisi. Tinatin, thanks for being with us. I'm wondering what your take is on the situation right now.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's great to see you again. Against the backdrop of this renewed wave of mass protests and, as you've seen, the violent dispersal of demonstrators by law enforcement across the country, not just in Tbilisi, the Georgian police have also raided several offices and homes of non-governmental organizations and opposition coalitions. They've even arrested several opposition leaders over the past day. But what is particularly notable, Mark, about the ongoing protests is that they've spread far beyond Tbilisi and a few other major cities, reaching almost every corner of the country, which was really not the case in the past months. And they're being organized at the grassroots level. As you may recall, the opposition leaders struggled to capitalize on post-election momentum. You and I discussed this in the days after the election. And what we're witnessing today is a nationwide movement without top-down leadership. It truly embodies a grassroots movement, which the country has so needed over the past years.
Just to clarify on that one, so very often in these kind of situations, from the outside, it looks like it's just a kind of urban, I'll say elite, that probably is not the correct word to use, but an urban movement or something going towards their ends. You're saying this is something that is far broader.
Absolutely, Mark. And actually, you used the word that I am also reluctant to use in these contexts. But in many ways, the movements that we saw in the prior months were more of an elite movement, including a lot of the opposition statements and narratives that were targeting the elites much more so than the broader population that is less perhaps concerned about Georgia's EU membership, although it is something that they think about, but it's not top of mind because they were mostly concerned about the bread and butter issues, which the opposition in many ways failed to address. But now what we're seeing is this public outrage beyond just Georgia's EU path, which is definitely very important, but what is far more important is that the country is essentially moving towards an authoritarian, not just an autocratic regime. And that is something that the Georgians have been standing up against for many, many decades, including during the late Soviet era.
Now, Tinatin, in that context, when the Prime Minister, Irakli Kobakidze, says to, or rather vows, to eradicate opposition, how sinister is that threat in these circumstances?
Well, of course, he is trying to not just make these statements, but to actually act on these words. And it is very, very concerning. Obviously, by no means is anyone trying to diminish the terrible negative impact that the violent dispersal, not just of the protesters, but also of the crackdown on the opposition leaders has had in terms of the effect on the public. But what is far more concerning is that the masks are completely off, Mark, at this point. They have, the Georgian Dream leaders have completely given up on any pretense of essentially just pretending, which is what they were doing the last few months, of still abiding by certain Euro-Atlantic aspirations of Georgia and at the same time trying to push their authoritarian rule and push it onto the public. Now it seems that they no longer are hiding behind the Georgian constitution, and in fact they've gone directly against the constitution.
So that situation, as it sounds, and we had the president of Georgia, Salome Zurabishvili, tell us in this studio that there was a real commitment from the country to move towards EU membership. It's what the people wanted, and this was at the time of the election in October. She said that things have been twisted in some way, and now we're seeing the fruits of that right now. I'm wondering, Tinatin, how long the people can continue to keep up this kind of protest, because protesting in this way, out in the streets, in the cold, it wears people down. Is there the appetite to keep doing that? Is there the motivation, the anger to keep doing that?
Mark, that is $1 million question. For this movement to maintain its momentum, I think here the role of the international community will be crucial. Beyond mere words of criticism and condemnation, some media reports have suggested that Brussels has been considering the possibility of suspending its visa facilitation agreement, which currently allows Georgian citizens to travel visa-free to EU countries. Now, the risk with this approach is that it may actually backfire, as the Georgian dream could very easily frame this action to the public, to their own public, as Europe essentially turning against the Georgian people, punishing Georgian citizens who have taken to the streets for this very action, rather than the government that has sharply moved away from its Euro-Atlantic orientation. But contrary to what we may have anticipated just a few months ago, I would say not just a few months, but even a few weeks, it's now more than likely that if the regime does collapse, it won't necessarily be due to the external factors. And I just want to underline here that by no means am I trying to minimize the importance of international response and reaction, but instead it'll be the internal processes and the disintegration of institutions that have always been very weak in Georgia post-Soviet collapse, and systems from within that could drive such an outcome. And this is something that the public, of course, cannot ignore. The stakes are incredibly high, not only for Georgia, but I would argue also for the wider region. While, of course, it's still too early to make any definitive predictions, we can already say with certainty that the outcome of these events will shape the geopolitical landscape in the South Caucasus, not just for Georgia, but also the broader Eurasian region in the years to come. So it is extremely difficult. It is extremely critical that the West stand by the Georgian people's side, because at the end of the day, the many people that I'm seeing on your screen right now that are in my native hometown of Tbilisi and beyond, they are not just fighting for their own European future, but also for the democratic future of the broader region.
Tinatin Japaridze, Eurasian political risk analyst at the Eurasia Centre. Thank you for joining us here and giving us your analysis of the situation and that essential context we need to truly understand the story. Tinatin, thank you for joining us here on France 24.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much indeed.